The unnamed protagonist faces two different entities simply known as Mr. Tomatoes, or more accurately, Mr. Tomato S, and Miss Lemons, or Miss Lemon S. The two talking entities with word-to-speech speaking abilities interact with the protagonist in different manners. Miss Lemons asks the protagonist several academic questions, while Mr. Tomatoes, on the other hand, asks the protagonist to feed him. It doesn't take long before these entities reveal their true forms, being hostile and anything but friendly. The question remains what these entities are and how did the protagonist end up in their domains. You can watch a previous video I made about Miss Lemons by clicking on the link above. Just as a side note, the story I explained on that video is heavily based on my own theories and interpretations, which completely divert from the actual story. So take it easy in the comment section, folks. I have a very sensitive soul. There are several endings in both of the games, which in here we will only focus on Miss Lemons. The different endings reveal her different forms, which are triggered by different actions and situations. A final secure digital file can be accessed called Project Ouroboros, which to some degree unveils who these entities once used to be and who the unnamed protagonist potentially is. The most common ending which can be achieved in most first playthroughs is the point when Miss Lemons transforms into a demonic alter version of herself known as Lamia. At this point, Miss Lemons demands the protagonist to play a set of rock, paper, scissors rounds with her, where the collateral is huge. At each point the protagonist loses, they lose a part of their body, such as an eye, a hand, and eventually their life. The game is soon revealed to be rigged, as no matter what the protagonist chooses, they always lose, with the altered Miss Lemons taking their life or kicking them out of the game. One aspect of Miss Lemons is revealed in here, that she seems to have more than one physical form, or at least personalities. As her main form, Miss Lemons is the least harmful and seems to be even friendly to some degree. She seems to be constantly in a state of internal conflict with herself, trying to prevent the other alter ego win over the body. After reaching irritation level 10, Miss Lemons, despite being overly blunt and mean, mentions she shouldn't blame the protagonist for their failure, when all of a sudden the alternate persona comes out, being a lot less forgiving and merciless. Lamia, the alter version of Miss Lemons, is very deceptive and cunning, as she instructs to play a game with the protagonist, a game which should have fair rules, but as the game starts, it's clear that Lamia tricked the protagonist, as she always wins. Towards the end, when the protagonist loses the left arm and an eye, they will eventually get kicked out of the game, revealing that the entirety of the story and the interaction is in fact just a game. In a different ending, if the players manage to answer all the questions correctly but miss a few, Miss Lemons bluntly explains how the protagonist is not the smartest of the bunch, but they still did good, when all of a sudden an alternate version takes over by the name of Lakshya. Lakshya, being a purple-colored entity, explains how boring the protagonist is and instead plays another game where the protagonist has to fight for their life. Throwing knives, circular saws, and chainsaws at the protagonist who has to avoid them, Lakshya, being a psychopathic entity, seems to be enjoying every single second of tormenting the protagonist. When, after narrowly surviving for some time, Miss Lemons manages to repossess her body. Miss Lemons explains how the protagonist bought enough time for her to come back, which reveals Miss Lemons has many different personas which are hostile and possessive, with Miss Lemons having no say in the matter and being controlled by them. This provides some extra files on the computer, which will be important in discovering more parts of the lore. In a different ending, if the protagonist unlocks the knife item and plunges it into Miss Lemons, she explains how this little attempt of killing her is pathetic, as nothing as such a useless item as a piece of metal could hurt a being like her. Miss Lemons in here seems to be more offended than hurt, as she makes a remark on how she would never let the protagonist back here again, letting them do this to anyone, when the protagonist gets kicked out of the game. Although this doesn't reveal any backstory to Miss Lemons and doesn't unlock any secrets, which might appear as a bad ending, in fact, this is a blessing in disguise, as the protagonist seems to be unharmed, with no alternate versions of Miss Lemons appearing who would sadistically torment the protagonist. This unveils the true nature of Miss Lemons, how forgiving and tame she is in contrast to her counterpart personas who take pleasure in hurting individuals they encounter. Alternatively, if the protagonist uses the knife on Miss Miss Lemons while being protected by an artifact which has the shape of a skull. It prevents Miss Lemons from removing the knife and hurting the protagonist. Miss Lemons explains how the curse of the skull prevents her from removing the knife, but regardless, her alter ego won't let her die this easy and won't let her go. Miss Lemons commends the protagonist, expressing her wishes of dying and despair to be free, revealing that she truly is a victim here and a prisoner by the other demonic-like entities which have possessed her body. The new entity named Lorelei has an eerie and ghastly nature who explains she cannot let Miss Lemons die as she is very important to her, and especially as she lives in the same body, which means destroying this body would possibly kill the other entities dwelling within it or would force them out to find other hosts to possess. Lorelei then reveals her true power on how she can manipulate alternate realities in which she can easily jump through, with her having the same memories yet recovering from any injury and getting rid of any threat. Lorelei simply switches between some realities and timelines, coming to one where she was never stabbed and then ultimately banishing the protagonist to a reality where they never existed, ultimately making the entirety of the efforts of killing Miss Lemons go to waste as if none of it ever happened. This depicts the unlimited powers of Miss Lemons, or at least the alternate entities controlling her body, which somehow come to interact with the players, getting to torment them in a playful manner just to entertain themselves. In a different ending, the protagonist has to play the Mr. Tomatoes game and use a kitchen knife to stab Mr. Tomatoes. As the game comes to an end, with the protagonist returning to Miss Lemon's game, a new alternate version of her reappears by the name of Lilith, who has a distinct, ghostly, white color. Lilith has a strange fascination with all terrible things. According to what the protagonist did, killing Mr. Tomatoes, it somehow allowed Lilith to take over and absorb Miss Lemon's soul. Lilith explains how she enjoys an absolute void where time and space stay still, with no sound or life, nothing existing, with just the presence of the protagonist's mind stuck forever with Lilith. This of course is one of the most horrifying endings, as it is worse than death, being stuck in a never-ending void which would drive one into insanity. Using the skull once more and answering many questions correctly, Miss Lemons becomes extremely impressed, rewarding the protagonist with valuable information which can be accessed in a secret file. She then bids the protagonist goodbye and gives them a birthday cake as a prize. In an alternate ending, or when we soon find out, an alternate reality, the protagonist manages to answer so many of Miss Lemon's questions correctly, which prevents any of her alternate personas to take over and punish and torment the protagonist in variety of ways. Miss Lemons, as promised, rewards the protagonist with Sage's ability, an ability as mentioned by her to act as an absolute pass to any place with knowledge and secret information. This of course allows the players to access a very important file called Project Ouroboros, which contains information about Miss Lemons and her personas. In Project Ouroboros, a decapsulation process takes place with the vessel being released. The vessel unveils how it has been subjected to entities which it refers to as parasites, controlling it and forcing it to do certain things. This of course means all the alter egos of Miss Lemons were the parasites the vessel refers to, with the vessel being the host who had to endure and witness these hostile entities use its body to carry out unspeakable acts. The vessel explains how it was in a state of coma, but now, after releasing it, the parasites have switched place with the vessel, with them being in a state of coma, but that unfortunately means that they are still dwelling within the vessel, waiting for the right time to awaken again. As the vessel leaves, thanking the protagonist, the truth about Miss Lemons is unveiled in the secret files. Miss Lemons has always looked for an intelligent student, and towards the end, she mentions how she will continue on her search to find more smart humans. Her obsession with testing and finding smart people, whom she refers to as student, is not revealed, but reading the secret recovered files in the Project Ouroboros, we get a hint of why that is. The introduction to the files opens on how a mysterious person, possibly the vessel who is acting as Miss Lemons, has granted the player access to the secret recovered files, as the original has been destroyed by the project creator. These files are highly confidential, as the creator doesn't know about them and would most likely destroy them as he did with the original. He destroyed the files as they conflict with ethical practices and experiments, revealing how evil the creator of this project truly is. Therefore, Therefore, Miss Lemons, or more accurately the vessel or the host who has endured the burden of several hostile personalities who dwell within her, has been searching desperately to find a worthy individual to help her get free and put an end to the cruel and inhuman practices of the Creator. This is at least what you might think to this point, that the vessel must be the same being as Miss Lemons, but the true backstory is more twisted and complicated. Going through the logs entered in the secret files, we learned that a scientist had a sick wife by the name of Maureen, whose mysterious terminal condition progressively got worse to the point of forcing the scientist develop his own breakthrough in science to cure his dying wife. After some time of successful experimentation, the scientist believes his research has allowed them to create the cure, which he takes to Capitol to get it approved. After successfully getting an approval, overjoyed with the intention to get back home and cure his sickly and dying wife, someone whom he shared a life with and grew as a person with, he comes to a cold and eerily quiet house to find out his wife, Maureen, died all alone without him when he went to the Capitol to get the very same cure approved. Horrified and shocked at the scene, watching his wife's lifeless body lying in a horrible condition, almost decomposing, the scientist can't help but get filled with anger and resentment for having to get his medicine approved, as if the process was a little quicker, his wife would still be alive. Losing the sense of himself and any medical ethical codes, he approaches a heartbroken person at a bar which he befriended by the name of Sebastian and tricks him into his lab to run unethical experiments on. Subsequently, he also approaches Sebastian's ex-partner, Louise, who coincidentally turns out to have been the scientist's assistant, also tricking her into his labs to run experiments on. He does all this in hopes of creating a vessel which he could use to bring his late wife back to life. Dismissing the sacred and priceless lives of Sebastian and Louise, people who trusted him, he mindlessly runs experiments on them to only achieve what's important to him, bringing his dead wife back to life. Louise turns out to have been a school teacher and Sebastian a waiter, hence why, in their new monstrous experimented on forms, they become entities which are associated to their previous careers, Louise becoming Miss Lemons, a cruel and punishing teacher who tests people relentlessly, and Sebastian becomes Mr. Tomatoes, an ever-hungry individual that demands food, acting as a customer rather than a waiter, making the protagonist to act as a waiter, taking all the frustration of the job on the protagonist. The scientist, after running several tests, finally manages to create a sentient and sound-minded digital entity which he refers to as the Vessel, an entity that seems to be just like humans, as if being a summoned or created human soul trapped in the digital realm. It's revealed in the later files that the scientist created the digital vessel to transfer the consciousness of Sebastian and Louise into it separately, which would open the possibility of extracting one's consciousness and preserving them in a human-like being, capable of communicating and having human attributes, hence the name Vessel. The later stages of how the digital consciousness could be brought to the physical realm, however, stay a mystery at this point. Louise Crimson, the former assistant of the scientist and also an ex to Sebastian who possesses Mr. Tomato's form, was a woman who was born in Louisville. She grew up in Crochadia and became interested in science since childhood. Louise studied hard and became one of the best students in her class, whichever grade she was in, always searching for more knowledge, hence why explaining her tendency of wanting to discover secrets and why she backed up the secret files before the scientist destroyed them, and has been looking for someone as interested in knowledge as herself so they can help her and Sebastian. Her file explains how her level of intelligence caused her digital form break, adapting several personalities with unfathomable powers. She also adapted a classroom as it would be the most fitting environment for someone as Louise, who is fascinated by education, knowledge, and science. It also turns out the scientists only used a ratio of 70 to 30% encapsulating the vessel, with the subject having access to 70% of the mind capacity, which allows one of the test subjects escape into the World Wide Web, making it very difficult for the scientists to find them. The vessel seems to have been placed in a cryosleep, a state of coma, to subjugate it and allow the subject to have 70% control, but due to the new events of the protagonist awakening the vessel, both Sebastian and Louise seem him to get trapped in the vessel, instead going into the cryo-sleep and possibly switching the percentage of control over the mind. But as it turns out, one of the subjects escaped, freeing more space in the vessel. That is why after killing Mr. Tomatoes, Lilith takes over and expresses her appreciation in Mr. Tomatoes dying, as if they were both occupying half of the 30% capacity, meaning now that Lilith has full control of the 30%, absorbing the rest of the space, she controls the mind and goes into a state of complete void. There's a third object with the access being denied, which in my opinion could be the scientist himself, the protagonist, or most likely his deceased wife, Maureen. But I guess we will only find out as soon as the next installment comes out. Alright folks, that's about it for this video. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to stay tuned as I'm planning to make much more about Miss Lemons and Mr. Tomatoes universe. It's been your host Star. Thank you folks for being here, and I will catch you on the next one. Have a fantastic day.